But it's my great pleasure today for us to be hosting Associate Professor Chris Brickell from the Gender Studies program, who's just written and launched this fantastic book that I encourage you all to buy. It's at the bookshop, right?
Yes, yep.
Teenagers, the Rise of Youth Culture in New Zealand. And I presume that this is taken from that research, so he'll be speaking on teenage history, popular media and the scrapbook self.
Yeah, thanks Rosie, and thanks everyone for having me, and apologies for having to cancel this seminar earlier in the semester. I had a bit of a family emergency. I'm still overexcited after Jacinda's visit earlier in the day, so I'm sort of slightly in this space of overexcitement. Today what I want to do is to talk a bit about particularly the media aspects of this book, which is quite a wide-ranging project that looks at leisure and education and work, and media and identity. And so what I want to do is just introduce the idea that I played around with a little bit in the book in chapter 4 of the scrapbook self, and thinking about the way in which media texts over time have been quite central, played quite a central role in the way that young people have set up and explored their own identities. So New Zealanders drew and have drawn, going right back into the 19th century, from international media texts and international ideas about what it meant to be young. And I don't want to suggest that New Zealand was a carbon copy of the international situation, and I don't want to suggest that media texts in some way have over-determined young people's identities. But I'm interested in thinking about the ways in which identity and youth have been put together, with media playing an important role in this. And just to, I guess, start, I've been intrigued with the writing of Miles Fairburn, as Hannah knows, who worked with me on my postdoc at Canterbury, and Miles suggests that New Zealanders were bricoleurs par excellence of international ideas about culture. And so thinking about the ways in which international kind of influences have not determined but have influenced the way that young people have forged their own relationships, identities and imaginaries. And I'm interested in drawing upon also a kind of a recursive approach, a bit out of social interactionism, thinking about the way that people interact both with one another and with the symbols that their culture provides as they build a sense of who they are at the time and place in which they live. So my sources for this book were reasonably broad, including photographs like this one here, which actually comes out of my grandmother's collection, some images she left behind when she went into a rest home, taken from Nelson in the 1940s. Diaries, letters, government reports, although less so, newspapers less so. I'm particularly interested in the text that young people have left behind that they have created themselves. So what I want to do today is to start with the 19th century and to think a little bit about the ways that written and visual imagery have helped to create young people's cultures and identities. This is an image from Christchurch in the 1860s, a fence covered in posters. You probably can't see what kinds of events are advertised on these posters, but we've got the Littleton Regatta, there's a boxing match somewhere, the Christie's Minstrels, oh here, the minstrel show here. One of the things about New Zealand in the 19th century that might surprise us is that it was actually quite a lively kind of cultural space. So not only did we have these kind of events in public, but also the classics that young people read, Shakespeare, Molière, middle-class boys and girls would often read in Greek and Latin. The sensation novels that dealt with sexual irregularities, insanities and cases of mistaken identities, which young people consumed avidly, much to the horror of the conservative members of society. By the mid-1860s, the colony's theatres showed stage adaptations of these kinds of plays and novels. The theatres were also the hangouts of prostitutes and brawlers, which meant they weren't seen as the most salubrious kinds of places for young people to hang out. Did that stop them? No. A wider social concern about young people's interest in sensation and pleasure actually shaped the way that youth was understood broadly in New Zealand during the middle of the 19th century. One of the responses to some of these kind of concerns was the emergence of the literary societies and mutual improvement societies of mid-19th century New Zealand. So young people would get together, they'd read the classics, they'd talk about what it meant to be a citizen, they'd talk about civic education, and they'd debate the issues of the day. So literature was a way into a kind of a civic engagement for the respectable middle classes, or the members of the emerging kind of respectable middle classes. And so topics like Tennyson is overrated and Burns is a truer poet than Longfellow, if you can imagine debating such topics, were the kinds of things that young people were discussing among themselves. These started off as male-only spaces, but by the 1860s, young women were involved in them too. In the 1880s, we saw a rapidly expanding secondary education system, more rapid than we might think. The numbers of young people going through secondary education in the 1870s increased rapidly through that decade, and the rise of the middle class, particularly in the 1880s, with the rise of clerical work in the cities. And this gave rise to some interesting youth culture forms, which I will talk a little bit about shortly. Literature and philosophy were the cornerstones of a liberal middle-class education. So young people decided what they liked, Byron or Tennyson or whoever, nailed their colours to the mast and really then kind of stood firm on that. So their kind of identity as an educated young person was based around the kinds of texts that they were reading. 19th century adolescents in New Zealand read voraciously, including the kinds of books and serials that were imported from England and America. And here are some examples. The Strand magazine, which was the magazine that included the Sherlock Holmes mysteries in instalments. I'm not sure if you're aware that Sherlock Holmes was originally provided not as a novel, but instalments in magazines, and a number of other quite well understood, famous literature was the same. Pearson's magazine was a mixture of literature and socialism. I wholly like the idea of this kind of magazine. Boys and Girls Own, which told of school stories and a bit of petty crime and a bit of kind of excitement, at the same time managing to be reasonably respectable. Mark Twain, Tennyson, George Eliot, Dickens, Mary Elizabeth Braddon's feminist love story Vixen was quite popular, and the irresistibly titled That Aggravating Schoolgirl, and I'm not sure what was in there, but I liked the title. Cicero, Plato, Burke, Hardy, Browning, Tolstoy, Schreiner, Shakespeare. These were all the kinds of things that young people were reading. Less respectable were the penny dreadfuls, or the penny novels, which are perhaps interestingly more well known than the more respectable kind of literature. Spring-Heeled Jack, Varney the Vampire, Charles Peace, or The Adventures of a Notorious Burglar. I don't know how many copies of these are still existing. I went onto eBay and tried to have a bit of a look and thought I'd go shopping, but actually they're really hard to find now, so I suspect the originals are collector's items. By the 1890s, we actually saw some new consumption practices emerging, and the most interesting city in New Zealand for looking at this is, of course, Dunedin, because Dunedin was the biggest, the most rapidly industrialising, the most interesting, the most sophisticated city in the New Zealand of the 1870s, 80s and 90s, and we see that in the architecture that was left behind. These are the kinds of city spaces, consumption spaces of the Dunedin of the 19th century. You'll recognise, of course, this, the old BNZ building, which was built in the 1880s and is still there, the Southern Cross Hotel here, the Exchange sadly has gone, but you see, but Dunedin was a bit of a bustling kind of metropolis. One of the major stores was Braithwaite's down in Princes Street, which was a gigantic bookshop emporium and popular culture kind of haven for young people who are seeking things to read and a place to hang out. So young girls and boys would browse in Braithwaite's. They were the flaneurs and flaneurs of 19th century New Zealand, wandering the streets, looking in the shop windows, buying books, consuming media, going to musicals, the musical theatre, the early concerts and so on. So you had a reasonably lively youth culture beginning to develop in New Zealand during this period. As the historian Ben Schrader reveals in Big Smoke, The History of the New Zealand City, the coffee stalls in Dunedin catered to, quote, night walkers, loose girls, fast gentlemen and dandified bucks. So actually, Friday night in Dunedin in the 1880s was quite exciting, in fact. And new subcultures emerged in these kind of spaces with their literary influences and their spaces to hang around in. The larrikin, of course, some of you will be familiar with. By engaging in, quote, a politics of gesture, symbol and metaphor, as British cultural theorist Dick Hebditch puts it about the larrikin, young people started building cultures of their own. Here is the masher. He was the middle-class young man. This guy's from Masterton in the Wairarapa. He was about 14 when this photo was taken. The masher uniform, the cane, the toothpick pointy shoes, the nicely turned out jacket. And the masher was a young man who enjoyed all that the city had to offer, from those kind of slightly disreputable theatres that were starting to clean up their act in the 1880s, through to the music halls and opportunities to wander the streets. So taste during this period signalled subculture and subcultural difference. In Gore, the men of the Young Men's Literary Society complained, like adults did, about the factory hands, pit boys and telegraph boys who devoured penny dreadfuls, they said, and filled their foolish brains with rubbish about highwaymen, pirates and other objectionable people. So adults and the more respectable young people came together in kind of joining forces in opposing this trashy public literature. Just a little bit on sexuality, because I can never give a talk without talking a little bit on sexuality. I kind of can never help myself. There was actually a bit around Dunedin. Actually, before I talk about the dead bird, not literally a dead bird, a magazine called The Dead Bird, let me just also show you, as a little kind of sideward segue tangent, this is Joseph Braithwaite's shop, one of the first shops in Royal Arcade. Have you guys ever heard of Royal Arcade? It's more or less where the warehouse is. It was one of New Zealand's very first shopping arcades, covered, bears striking resemblances to the arcades of Paris at the same time. See, I told you Dunedin was like New Zealand's most kind of sophisticated city, right, at this point. And it totally was. So this is the interior of Royal Arcade, and so you can sort of see these very urban sort of spaces with a bookshop where media can be produced and consumed at the entrance to the space where young men would run up and down in a diabolical kind of fashion during the 1870s. It actually opened during the 1860s, Farley's Royal Arcade, so that gives you a sort of sense again. Now sexuality, I was going to talk about sex. Sex, of course, was to be found in the shelves of Braithwaite's bookshop, where young men would go and browse among the pamphlets talking about sexual crimes, and then they'd buy them and share them all around and scandalise one another and any adult who kind of wandered past. They would also buy a magazine called The Dead Bird. The Dead Bird was produced in Australia, but it was widely available in New Zealand. And in fact, if, as a young person or as an older person, you went on the train between Dunedin and Oamaru, say, the hawkers would walk up and down the carriages selling you such filth if only you cared to pay. The dead bird scandalised the respectable, particularly Sir Frederick Truby King, who was both the superintendent of the Seacliff Lunatic Asylum, as it was then called, and also a kind of a fervent guardian of public morals. So, breasts, nakedness, revealed ankles, stories about sodomy, divorce, debauchery. What's not to like? Who wouldn't want to buy a copy of this as a 16-year-old travelling around Otago? I'm presuming that's no one, so I'm not even going to look up and scan the hands too carefully. Okay, I want to talk about the 20th century now. So what we saw in the 19th century was a real sort of setting up of youth cultures, and the fact that those youth cultures were quite significantly impacted by print culture. Print culture was an important part of that. Other forms of media came into their own during the 20th century. The cinema really started up in New Zealand in about 1910, 1911. No, that's not good enough. I can give you a more specific date, and I will in just a moment. But before the cinema started up, what you had was this emerging culture of young people swapping cards of the stars of the music hall. So here we've got Miss Phyllis Dare, and this was a card that was swapped between two girls in Oamaru at the start of the century. And one of them said, I've got lots more of these I can swap if only you want. So there was this emergent kind of media kind of culture based around swapping cards of stars who many of these kids probably never ever saw. Some of them toured New Zealand, including Miss Tittle Brune, and this is a picture of Tittle Brune here. But many of them didn't. So it was a kind of a fan culture based on musical stars who would not necessarily actually be seen by young people. This, of course, changed remarkably in terms of movies, but it was very much the precursor to the fan culture of the film. Okay, the cinema. The world's first feature-length film, I had read, and you might have heard otherwise, and that's totally cool too, but I had read was actually the story of the Kelly Gang, about Ned Kelly, and it was of course, the Australian story about Ned Kelly, and it was released in 1906, and then played in community halls around New Zealand. 1911, the first cinema opened, and by 1915, Auckland had 13 cinemas just in Auckland. So the 1910s saw this instant boom in film. By 1916, American films accounted for 95% of all of those shown here, and a third of New Zealanders went to the pictures each week. Some young people went to the pictures twice a day, so they dragged up the kind of average of film going in New Zealand, which is quite kind of intriguing. So you had a kind of a building upon the musical cultures. And of course the early cinemas were fantasy palaces, really. This is the Regent from Wellington. One young person described it as a bit like a sort of a church in a way, crossed with a fantastic kind of thing. You know, immensely detailed theatres, just absolutely fantastic. And of course you'd watch your film and you'd go out and you'd get a pie in the interval, come back juggling your boiling hot pie, and sitting here in this sort of palace with all the stars above and the kind of totally outrageous kind of architectural wonderfulness. Okay, does anyone know who these guys are?
Tarzan?
Yep. So we have here Elmo Lincoln playing Tarzan and Enid Markey playing Jane. A young girl called Alison MacLeod, grew up in Christchurch, and in 1918 she wrote in her diary about the attractions of Tarzan. Lincoln, she said, has such a refined, gentle yet strong face and such a massive frame and limbs. Well, she wasn't wrong there looking at the picture. He was the man for the part. He looked so handsome too. I'm not so sure about that. He must be a handsome man even when he's dressed modernly. Of course, as Tarzan, he has only a skin around his waist. The way he swung through the trees was marvellous, from bough to bough, leaping and swinging through the treetops. And climb, he must be very strong too, because in one part he swung up and down by the branches and supplejacks with the girl clinging to him. Such fun being that girl. And Enid looks quite sort of delighted, so I think Enid probably had some fun playing Jane, kind of swinging along. About this time, advertising started targeting young female consumers. Now, girls were targeted as consumers by capitalism in New Zealand about 40 or 50 years before boys were. And so the teen consumer was female for quite a long time, both in the way that girls understood themselves and the way that teenagers were understood more broadly. In the 1920s and 30s, the magazines began talking about the modern girl. We had an increasing culture of office work for girls, young women in white-collar careers, and so magazines and advertisers within this context were targeting middle-class girls as consumers. Like the advertisements that began targeting young female consumers, films also moulded adolescent selfhood and desire in commercially acceptable ways. The movie moguls became highly skilled at the latter, and shareholders held all the cards in Hollywood. Films shaped gender identities by spinning fantasies, disseminating new fashion trends, and building upon the rudimentary fan cultures of the early 1900s, which I've already talked about. Then the flapper image accompanied the silent film. And even though few girls could emulate the lifestyle of their stars, they could adapt markers of their modernity, like their bobbed hair and shorter skirts. Okay, what about boys? Boys in theatres complained about the love films, as they called them, burst paper bags every time the stars kissed, and were made uncomfortable by stars like Rudolph Valentino. And so they were all a bit uncomfortable about this new, suave, gentler form of romantic masculinity, thinking that this was a little bit too kind of dicey. So I think girls were more interested in Valentino often than boys were. So movie-going was a profoundly gendered experience. And on one level, it brought boys and girls together in the same physical space, but on the other hand, it kind of split across what tended to appeal to particular groups. There's a really interesting 1927 Dunedin study that talks to high school pupils, boys and girls, about what kind of films they like. And I won't go into that, but there's more about that in the book. Okay, so thinking about the idea of the scrapbook self, which is an idea I was thinking about in relation to the 1930s and 40s. So the label teenager appears to have emerged in the US in about 1930, not during the 1950s as we commonly assume, but at the start of the 1930s. In New Zealand, the term appears in the media during the 1940s, even though the 50s are the high point of the emergence of that kind of term. The scrapbook self, I was thinking, is a kind of pastiche of cultural influences and diverging social norms that arose from the continued and increased interaction of youth and consumer culture. And what you see is young people working with the themes and tropes that emerge inside of media cultures in order to put together a kind of sense of taste and style and identity. So you had girls, for instance, increasingly in schools making themselves up if they could sneak in makeup under the nose of the teacher in order to imitate their film stars, their heroines. Or, as one woman who worked in a Dunedin factory said to me, that she flattened her hair in order to appear more like Joan Crawford, and it was such a nightmare because her hair wouldn't flatten properly, so she had this sort of half-flattened kind of imitation that really looked totally kind of wonky. But young people were fashioning themselves after this very highly visual kind of media world. Radio became increasingly important from the 1930s, and you had things like the mass circulation magazines in New Zealand. Someone once said, and I need to find this quote, I have no idea where to find it, that New Zealand had two main cultural institutions during the 1940s, 50s and 60s. One of them was the New Zealand Women's Weekly, and the other one was the New Zealand Truth, which is a scandalous broadsheet thing that no one admitted to reading, but everyone did. I had a woman once after a seminar came up to me and said, "Women never read the Truth." And then, so when I interviewed women after that, I said, "Oh, someone said to me once, women never read the Truth." And they said, "Oh, what a load of rubbish. Of course we read it. We might have just sneaked it when no one else was looking." So you had this kind of, this general New Zealand media culture, some of which, like the Truth, was totally scandalous. The Truth was famous for listing every single divorce in New Zealand, apparently. I've never found out whether it actually did. And the Women's Weekly, of course, had a massive circulation, so too did the Listener before it turned sort of right-wing. Huge, really. But what you also had happening was a kind of a set of more youth-specific media. Now, I've got my slides slightly out of order because I was playing with this last night and I couldn't work out in my head which order to have them in. So I'm going to talk about Andy Hardy first before I show you the picture of 17 magazine. 17 magazine and Archie, both of these date from the 1940s. Who grew up as a fan of Archie a bit? Archie's still going, which is so cool, and so is 17 actually. So these kinds of papers, which were targeted at young people, bought and widely disseminated in New Zealand, very much brought American ideas into the New Zealand kind of cultural setting, and young people took these up quite avidly. One of the other things that emerged in the 1930s, and I didn't know about this really, and you guys would probably know more than I did, was the emergence of the teenage film. And I was really familiar with these in the 1980s, the whole kind of Brat Pack films of the 80s, you know, which defined being a teenager for those of us who were, you know, quite captivated by Judd Nelson and Molly Ringwald and the others. But the precursor to these actually lay in the 1930s in the Andy Hardy films. So Mickey Rooney was Andy Hardy. I had a thought last night suddenly in my election mode that James Shaw looked a bit like the young Mickey Rooney, and then I went and did a Google Images and decided that maybe not quite, but there was some kind of resemblance there. So Andy Hardy, played by Mickey Rooney, and The Girl Next Door, played by Judy Garland. And there was a series of about 12 of these films that looked at love gained and lost and unrequited love and all these other kind of teen kind of themes, in a sense. And these were hugely popular in New Zealand. So not only did young people in the cities hear about these and see these, but they were actually toured around some of the tiny little towns. There was actually a roadshow around Banks Peninsula, the little wee settlements of Banks Peninsula, and there was also a roadshow around the little wee tiny hamlets of central Otago. So these American themes actually reached into the lives of New Zealanders in small settlements as well as the big cities. So teenagers all around New Zealand saw aspects of their own lives reflected on the silver screen. By the 1940s, New Zealand had twice the number of seats to patrons as the movie-mad United States. So New Zealanders loved film, hugely so. You might think the US was the high point of film, New Zealanders were even more kind of keen. So what I found in those diaries of boys and girls who went twice a day perhaps isn't such a surprise given this. Shirley Albiston, whose diaries I read, really fascinating on a whole range of areas of young New Zealanders' lives. So Shirley Albiston grew up in Wellington. She wandered through Wellington and described the sparkle of the city's movie wonderland. She says, "When I went down into the town, the coloured lights outside the picture shows were sparkling and glancing on and off. And there were young girls without hats laughing and leaning on the arms of tall boys." which is an image, I conjured an image I really liked. I found that really, really appealing. What went on inside the movie theatres, including in the back row, of course, was not something that Shirley wrote about. Shirley didn't like boys and she didn't like American films. And it appears that Shirley might later on become a nun, but I'm not entirely sure on that. But she was a good observer of New Zealand culture, which is what I really liked about Shirley. 13-year-old Jean McLeod is someone else I really like. She's actually the aunt of the columnist Rosemary McLeod. Really fabulous. Rural girl, really into glamour, really into playing rugby with her brothers, that kind of New Zealand colonial girl, that fascinating kind of mixture of the rugby playing, hanging out on the farm, sassy, smart, giving cheek to whoever will kind of cross her path. But at the same time, she was totally adoring of the American film stars. Olivia de Havilland, Merle Oberon, Robert Taylor, she adored all of them. She modelled herself on the women at various points. Anyone who owned a magazine would find it with bits of it stripped out, cut away by her as she'd make scrapbooks and stick them up all over the walls. And they had a rabbiter on the family farm. They were quite well off, and he'd find whole pages of his daily news missing. And her friends and sisters and brother would swap pictures among themselves and between themselves. And they saw every film on offer in the Regent in Masterton. So she totally fell in love with Robert Taylor. I can totally understand that. As well as de Havilland and Oberon and others. Others I'd never actually heard of until I read her diary. The movie industry went into hyperdrive during the 1930s, and for those young people seeking to construct an identity around the glamour of Hollywood, there was an increasing range of cultural resources available for them to do so. There was a whole slew of magazines, mostly from America, that flooded the eager market. Jean bought Screenland, Movie Mirror, Modern Screen, Scream Romances, Hollywood Photoplay and Motion Picture Magazine, all of which were available in Masterton, a relatively smallish town, north or east of Wellington. Jean's brother, Nev, also practiced a kind of scrapbooky selfie thing in a way. He would actually cut out photos of arty things from newspapers and stick them all over his bedroom wall and say, oh, impressive, as he'd stick up the latest one that he really liked. And so while Jean was a really kind of movie-mad kind of girl, her brother Nev was really into creating an art gallery of taste and style, and in the process actually conveying something of himself. Very occasionally you see photos of 1930s and 40s bedrooms, and this is interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, as New Zealand became more wealthy, people were more likely that each child would have their own bedroom. This hadn't been the case up until that point. And part of that then is that then allowed them to decorate and show and express themselves all over the walls, with sticking stuff up and modifying kind of pictures and so on. So there's a kind of a connection between an emerging teenage culture, a scrapbook culture, and having the private space in which to do so. So all of those kind of socio-economic kind of factors feed into the story of emerging teenagehood. I mentioned before that Jean and her friends decorated her own body, and their own bodies, and Jean says, Phyllis bought powder and a puff for me, played at makeup saloons. I was Madame Marina and Phyllis was Dame Loretta. And I mentioned the kind of flattening of the hair going on among Dunedin's factory girls. Not always was one's scrapbooking a total success. Beatrice McCann, who was Colin McCann's sister, I think. Her diary's in the Hocken. And she had a suitor called Edgar. It was this off and on again thing with Edgar. And Beatrice said, oh, he's been going to too many moving pictures, she said. All those hells and gods, she said. I just want to laugh at him. Poor old Edgar. Edgar's scrapbook self did not prove to be particularly popular. Beatrice laughed at Edgar's attempt to present himself as worldly and sophisticated. Poor blighter. So you had a kind of a young people's world that was often distancing itself from their parents. It was embracing youthful style. Jean MacLeod's teacher told them off for dressing up as their kind of, and putting makeup on and so on. So teenagers, by the 1930s and 40s, finally New Zealanders had a serviceable name for themselves. I mentioned that the term was American, but it wasn't, it was kind of came in during the 40s. What did people use before that? Young, youth, girl, boy, adolescent, but that was quite a technical term used more in a kind of a psychological kind of setting. The rise of psychology is another kind of theme in the book, which I won't go into today. So teenager, as a theme, signified American, it signified a stage of life, it signified a particular set of styles and a particular engagement with media texts, particularly those kind of American ones now. I was just going to, here you go, here's 17 in Archie. I got as early as I sort of could with my covers. So that's a 1941 issue of 17 and Archie #1. If anyone's ever wondered what Archie #1 looked like, there it is. Comics collectors. Has anyone got one?
I've got newer Archie.
Yeah.
Not that one, obviously.
I might borrow some.
Yeah, my little Veronica.
Yeah. There's also a spin-off, isn't there? Riverdale.
Yeah. It's a new show, current show.
Mm.
Well,
So,
now Archie's battling zombies and things, so they've taken all kinds of weird directions.
Oh, I like the old one.
so it lives on, eh? Okay.
So when was the first Archie?
The first it's in the book. I can't remember if I cut out here. It's 40s. Yeah, the 40s. You mustn't get me started on this because I'm a big fan of the 40s. All sorts of interesting things happened in the 40s, and I could talk for another hour on the 40s, and I won't. But it was actually quite a pivotal decade. Of course, the war. And the end of the war, comics flooded into New Zealand during the Second World War. Some of them were quite violent and certainly quite sexualised. And there were complaints about the comics kind of pouring into New Zealand during the war. And then the Marines and the kind of excitement around the Americans. So I guess I see in some ways the 40s as as a bit more of a substantial kind of point of emergence of the New Zealand teenager, because you had the fusion of the war and the American films and comics and so on really starting during that period.
And in 1941.
Oh, right at the start of the 40s. Yeah. I think it's quite neat to think of our own kind of society connected intimately to the 40s. I can't possibly talk about teenagers without showing the picture of James Dean. So here's James Dean. Just mentioning briefly before I conclude the kind of moments of the 1950s. Blackboard Jungle, which is a really cool film. Rebel Without a Cause, which is also a really great film, but I think was banned in New Zealand for quite a long time. So I don't know how many young people actually got to see Rebel at that point. Blackboard Jungle wasn't banned. But thinking again, James Dean, the way young people kind of forged a style around this, and I've just got a quote before my conclusion by one of the young men who was interviewed, or old men by that point, interviewed, not by me, talking about the 1950s. I had the haircut, I had the clothes, we had the music, we had everything. I was content. I came to do the James Dean thing. I couldn't find a pair of Levi's and I couldn't find the right jacket, but I had the white t-shirt, so I went and bought a beautiful black jacket and had a beautiful golden leopard skin lining. I decided I wanted one at that point. Black stovepipe pants, and I had white socks and black slip-on shoes. This was it. I was hot and ready to go. It was neat. He said of his growing up in Hamilton in the 1950s. Okay, so in conclusion, just in the last few minutes, the idea that Fairbairn had of the kind of Brickell, the kind of New Zealander who put together a range of different cultural influences from overseas in a pastiche to create something quite, in some ways imitative and in other ways quite distinctive. And this is where my story of Jean MacLeod and Masterton really appeals to me hugely, because you have a sense of that outdoors girl in a very New Zealand space. But she grew up in quite a well-off family. They had a car, so their parents would drive them into Masterton. She'd buy all those screen magazines and go to all the latest films. So there's this really interesting kind of fusion of someone who 1 minute is kicking a football round and sticking a Norfolk pine thing down her brother's neck, which she did periodically in order to annoy him, and then off they go, and then she wants to be Merle Oberon. So there's this really interesting fluid, New Zealand-y kind of American-y kind of thing going on. A very New Zealand take, perhaps, on international influences, which I think is quite intriguing. Certainly the Americanisation of young people's society. I think it would be wrong to assume that New Zealand wasn't influenced by American society in the 19th century. It certainly was. The Masher was British, but he had an American equivalent called the Dude, which I quite like too. And the Dude was an import from the US, and the Masher was an import from the UK. The Dude was said to be named after duds, which of course is slang for clothes. The Masher was named after the Victorian term verb to mash, which means to flirt. So there's weird kind of little things that you kind of discover. So although media texts did not wholly construct what adolescence meant or what adolescence felt like, they did play, I think, a key role in the reflexive processes of everyday life and in the broad cultural shape of teenagehood. So media, I think, is a very important part of the story of the emergence of teenagers in New Zealand. And of course, as I've done radio interviews and things about the book, we inevitably end up talking about social media and thinking about the ways in which social media has come to define youth culture more recently. And I'm not going to say anything more about that now, other than to say that that's a sort of the latest instalment in a long history of engagement with media, which, as we've seen, goes right back into the 1860s and the 1850s. So it's actually quite a long story of change and continuity once we start looking at it in all its breadth. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Chris. It's a great talk, and it made me think a lot about some of our masters and honours projects, the selfies, what young people watch in the movies, but also stuff we teach all the time in media days. But start with a question from Paul.
First, I will need to correct myself. The characters first appeared in Pep Comics in December 1941.
Okay.
The first issue of Archie there was dated winter 1942.
Okay.
And if you have a copy, its record sale price is $167,000.
Wow.
So we can all tell partly to this author. My actual question is about class. Because,
yes, good.
Well, because in the States, certainly you have the picture palaces, which generally were more expensive admission prices and catered to middle-class audiences, especially middle-class women who were out shopping. But then you also had the Nickelodeons, which were much cheaper and for a more working-class audience. And that got me thinking about class in terms of the relationship of young people to city space. I assume there must be some split like that in New Zealand.
Certainly in the 19th century, you kind of had a split between a larrikin culture, which was basically essentially working class culture, and the masher culture, which was very much a middle class culture. So that you had a sort of an emergence going on in a quite a class split. In the 20th century, for girls, the image of the flapper, although in many ways it drew on a kind of a middle class aesthetic, it does appear to have spread more broadly across the range. So class appears as less immediately obvious during the 20th century than it does perhaps in the 19th century. The other thing in terms of Hebditch and others have argued that in the UK there was a certain class convergence during the 1950s, and so the image of the the motorbike riding rebel and the kind of schoolboy or schoolgirl who's behaving rebelliously. Those kind of images spoke to both a middle class and working class audience in a sense, because secondary education became much more available to working class kids through that middle part of the 20th century. So the high school as a kind of a bit more of a melting pot perhaps than you had earlier. Of course in the 19th century secondary education was for middle class kids, not working class ones. So there's almost this sort of ebb and flow, I think, of class, which is quite intriguing, quite severe lines in the 1880s. So that whole movement of trying to take working class kids off the streets and discipline them, that's really clearly obvious in the New Zealand cities of the late 19th century, drawing upon British and American child-saving kind of innovations. The saving, of course, as much a mode of regulation as it was about saving anyone. But yeah, the 20th century is strangely less demarcated, it seems, on the surface anyway. Karen?
Just in relation to that, I was curious about the teenagers that were going to the movies twice a day. And did you have a sense of their social class background, and does that mean they weren't in school, and just kind of curious about how they managed to do that?
The answer is they just bunked off school a lot. And so the guy who did that, his diaries would go, went to school, did this, yada, yada, yada. And then the next diary entry would be, stayed at home, made a hat rack, mended puncture and bicycle, went to a film, went home, had dinner, went to another film. And he would seemingly just, some days, just didn't go to school. And I think that was not uncommon, really. I found other examples of that. In the 19th century, those who did go to school would again sort of disappear periodically and so on. So school attendance seemed to be less uniform than we might sort of imagine now, perhaps. And it seemed at all uncommon for kids just to go, oh, well, I'm just not going to school, I'll go to the movies instead.
And they obviously had the means to do so.
Yes.
Because this is 1930s and
yeah. Well, no one has asked me, I should confess that I've been worried a question would come asking how much it cost to go to the movies at that period, and I don't know. I think it must have been reasonably affordable if the numbers of New Zealanders going were so high, but actually I don't know how an entry fee to the movies would compare then with how it would compare now.
When I was a teenager, we snuck into movies sometimes, so I mean, potentially that was going on as well. Depends which cinema, where it was.
Yeah.
Some old person sleeping at the desk after it started.
Rosie?
You write in the book about moral panics, and I know when you address youth cultures, you have to sort of address that. I was wondering if there were any panics. Certainly in Australia, there was panics about too much American influence and this idea that America was sort of corrupting or dominating. Did any of that happen in New Zealand, like that America was sort of seen as sort of the particular site of a problem for you?
I was expecting to find that and I didn't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I don't know what that means quite. I mean, even in the 40s, where there were complaints about comics that, as one critic called it, were essentially, quote, hypodermic injections of sex and murder, unquote. They didn't pinpoint where those things had come from, simply that they were sort of pouring in the borders. And interestingly, another side of that kind of concern was truth, because truth circulation, perhaps to some extent, was compromised by all of these more specific forms of media pouring into New Zealand. And so they sort of complain about, sexualised media and so on, which of course was total hypocrisy, because this was truth's stock in trade, really, was that kind of peddling in sex and salaciousness. So, yeah, I kept thinking I'd find evidence of New Zealand, of America being a particular problem, but I kind of didn't. I mean, even in the 1920s, government officials were complaining about the crook films or the kind of crime films that young people were reading, and again, oddly, America wasn't sort of positioned as the source of them. But I know in Aussie it was definitely, and I did read a bit about that too. Yeah, Brett.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'm interested in this might be beyond the scope can argue is something that's invented in the 1950s,
Yeah.
sort of teen
Yeah.
culture and so on. But in what you're suggesting, it seems to be that this is something you might be able to chart across the centuries as characteristic of
Yes, absolutely.
youth identity.
Yes.
So that leads. So the question I'll ask then is, how do you define that kind of rebellion? Is it like an Oedipal situation? Are we talking about family unit structures that are the basis for that? Like what was the like in the New Zealand context?
Well, I think in the 19th century, in the 19th century it was about class. It was very strongly about. And Frank Bongiorno has written about this in Australia too, in terms of the kind of regulation of morals in Australia. That there was a sort of rise. The rising middle class came with attempts to quite strongly demarcate itself from the working class, and so that kind of moral kind of distinctions and notions of respectability operated in service of that essentially. And then by the 1940s, you had the increasing rise of a kind of psychology, or the impact of psychology in New Zealand, and then you had the notion of groups of young people who weren't provided with the tools to manage the modern world. And so you had one of the Catholic psychiatrists, for instance, was talking about that the modern world doesn't have a place for young people very much, and so they can go off the rails. What struck me as interesting about those arguments is that young people seem much more suited to the modern world than the adults who are complaining about them. In terms of the Freudian stuff, that's not my territory at all, so yeah, I'm less. But certainly, yes, notions of respectability go back a long way, and they are related to class and to the rise of psychology and that kind of social control around that, I think, yeah.
Sort of on that same topic, what you're talking about is quite mainstream culture, like it's obviously cinema and stuff, it's quite accessible. So what did the counterculture was less mainstream? Because teenagers aren't homogenous, they have everything, so what did that look like? Sort of, or do we not have a good picture of that because it wasn't as mainstream?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. Yeah, we don't have as good a picture as we might hope. I think too because a lot of the recording mechanisms, so diaries and letters, tended to be a more middle class form of writing. That becomes a little bit kind of tricky. Oral histories have got to some of it for the later period, so 1950s and so on. But I guess I don't know whether New Zealand's youth subcultures were that much commented on. If they were, it was sort of, if it wasn't respectable, it wasn't talked about an awful lot. I mean, there's sort of discussion of young people fighting in the movie theatres and making trouble, and then kind of fighting in the streets and beating up their opponents in the Auckland Domain and that kind of stuff. But they're sort of reports from outside, essentially. Voices from inside the non-mainstream subculture historically are extraordinarily difficult to find because of the sources that that have survived and what hasn't survived too. I wish I knew more actually, but you never know. Things might filter to the surface. Yeah.
Hi, I'm writing my honours thesis on selfies, and a part of my dissertation is about memory. And I was wondering, you might not have come across it, or it might not be like one of your focal points or something. But I was just wondering, if, like, through your research of the scrapbook self and seeing how it kind of helped young people form identities, if that had impacted the way that they remembered New Zealand at that time, or kind of like framed it in a way that helped them form an affective attachment to what they thought of as New Zealand as they kind of grew up and it modernised and became a bit more like global.
Oh, that's really interesting, yeah. I guess there's a real immediacy about the sources like letters and diaries. So you have the sense that they're responding right then to the influences and sources and inspirations that are in front of them at that point. So there's not an awful lot of looking backwards, and there's not an awful lot of looking forwards. It's almost like living in the moment of what's appealing and what helps them to appear as modern in that kind of moment in which they're doing that. Yeah, I think it's quite a, that the reference point is quite narrow in terms of it being about then and now, or right now, in a sense.
Cool.
This was really just, I mean, obviously you know way more about this than I do. I was just going to throw a quick comment out there for the gentleman to my right. One of the, all I know about this really is sort of like John Savage's teenage book. But one of the things he brings up there is just that idea that a lot of the initial concern with youth culture is distinct from adult culture was about inner city children who were sort of had lost their way, had no supervision, or were running wild on the streets. So so just going back to the point about respectability, that's all.
Yeah, to come back to the early question too, and in the New Zealand imaginary, the rural and the outdoors seem to play more of a role than imagining the cities as really dangerous and terrible places, which isn't to say that the latter isn't there, but there's a constant notion of New Zealand teenagehood being harking back to a kind of colonial outdoors kind of culture, and perhaps the importance of rurality in the New Zealand imaginary has meant that there's been less focus put on the inner cities as that kind of dangerous space. Although, of course, there was certainly complaints about what went on in the cities in the jazz halls of the 1930s and 40s, and the inner city Wellington when the Marines were visiting and so on. But the frame of reference seems to be broader spatially somehow in the New Zealand context. Holly, do you?
Thanks for that, Chris. That was really fascinating. I was just wondering if you could unpack a point that you mentioned earlier about the female teenager being the side of consumption before teenage boys. And I was just wondering if you could just unpack the politics of that. I mean, it probably wasn't because young women had more disposable income. Was it because they weren't working as much as boys, so they had more time to self-fashion? Like, what's the kind of politics there?
It seemed to be quite connected with, for a couple of things, with the huge rise of office work for girls and young women from about 1900. What happened in 1900 is the typewriter revolutionised the office, and as it did so, vast numbers of girls were sucked into commercial careers, which they often abandoned after they married, of course, but they were sucked into commercial careers from about 1900 through to about 1920. And that, I think, was the office girl who was the key kind of target for the fashion advertisers and so on at that kind of moment. Whereas boys, it didn't appear, nothing really seemed to have happened with boys until the Beatles visit of 1964, and this forced young New Zealand men to up their game a bit, I think. And advertisers started advertising Beatles kind of clothes and jewellery and all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I think what happened with girls was related to the rise of the office girl, and of course the flip side of the rise of the office girl was the decline of domestic service, which also happened at that time. And girls had greater incomes out of office work, and they had more independence than their domestic servant predecessors. And so that created a space for both consumption and new leisure practices. So yeah, it keeps going back to these kind of structures of what the labour force looked like and those new opportunities. And of course more girls became secondary school students, and that created after school time and spaces too. And summer holidays as well, which affected leisure,
I wonder, the scrapbook itself, the idea seems to be sort of like a search for culture, a melding together of different ideas.
Yes, a melding, yes.
So I wonder if it was like similarly applicable to Māori and Pākehā teenagers.
I think it becomes more clear with Māori teenagers during the 50s, when you have that large-scale migration from the rural areas into the cities, and then it becomes more visible. And so there's a really interesting set of photographs, collection of photographs in the museum in Kaitaia from about 1955, which have a lot of young Māori and Pākehā, and groups of young Māori and Pākehā in that kind of place. And in terms of the clothing, you can start to see some really interesting evidence of the way that clothing and clothing style is shaped among both Māori and Pākehā young people. The photographer who took those images, and there were about 4 of the 5 of them in the book, I think. I can't remember his name, but he was Māori himself, and that actually led to a much more interesting set of images, because before then, you know, Pākehā photographers looked through a very othering kind of lens, but these images are really intimate and interesting because that barrier seemed to have been broken down by him. So we certainly start to see evidence through that big rural-urban migration that was happening about then.
If there's no more questions, we might move to the tea room for
Cool.
the function. But join me again in thanking Chris for being
Cool, thanks everyone.